Episode 1. The First Glow. They told me the altar had always been ordinary. Wood darkened by centuries of prayers, wax hardened into rivers down its edges. A place where people knelt and whispered secrets they could never confess to the world. But on that night, something shifted. It began with silence. A silence so sharp it cut through the hymn being sung. Every voice faltered at once. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Then, before our eyes, the altar glowed. Not with candlelight, not with the reflection of lanterns, but with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't fire. There was no heat, no smoke. The wood did not burn, yet it shimmered as if alive. It pulsed like a heartbeat, brighter and brighter, until the carved crucifix above it was drenched in a crimson hue. I swear, I saw the eyes of Christ painted there flicker, as if they were looking back at us. Gasps rose from the pews. Some crossed themselves in haste. Others whispered, "A miracle." But I felt it immediately. It was not the kind of light that warms or comforts. It was the kind that stares back, the kind that knows you. At the very front, a boy no older than 12 leaned forward, his face pale, his lips trembling. I remember his voice breaking the silence. "It's calling me." The crowd recoiled, but the boy stepped closer. His small shadow stretched unnaturally long, bending toward the altar as though dragged forward. The glow pulsed harder with every step he took, like it was answering him. Father Rodrigo, the parish priest, tried to hold the boy back, his hands gripping the child's shoulders. "Stay away! This is not for you!" he shouted. But the boy's eyes were fixed on the light, wide with terror and fascination. Then he whispered a name, not his own, not the name of God, a name no one recognized. The moment it left his lips, the glow flared so violently that every candle in the church blew out, plunging us into blackness, except for that impossible light. And in that light, I swear I saw something moving, a shadow without a body, a figure behind the altar, tall, unmoving, yet unmistakably alive. We screamed, some ran, others fell to their knees begging forgiveness, but the boy only smiled faintly, as if he had finally been found. The altar did not burn, the wood did not crack, yet in our hearts, something had been scorched forever. That was the night the village changed, the night the altar first glowed without fire, and the night we realized it would never again be silent. Episode 2, The Ashless Flame. People said it was imagination, that fear had painted shadows where none existed, but the altar did not forget, neither did we. By morning, the story had already spread across the village. How a nameless glow had filled the church, how a boy spoke to it as if answering a summons. Some called it a miracle, others, blasphemy. Yet none could explain the impossible. Wood that gleamed like burning coal but left no ash, no scorch, not even the faintest smell of smoke. Father Rodrigo barred the doors, swore to cleanse the place with prayer. But curiosity has its own gravity. By the end of the week, strangers were arriving. Pilgrims, scholars, skeptics, all demanding to see the altar that burned without fire. I was there the night they came. Learned men with notebooks and instruments, measuring light, testing air, knocking at the wood with hammers to prove it hollow. They set their devices down, eager to explain what they did not yet understand. And then it happened again. The glow rose slowly, breathing through the wood as if the altar itself were alive. No candle had been lit. No torch had been touched, yet the air filled with a silent hum, a pressure that pressed against our chests. One of the scholars laughed, too loudly, his voice cracking. "A trick of gases," he insisted. He pressed his palm flat against the surface of the glowing wood. I watched his smile falter. His hand did not burn, but his lips parted in shock. Then horror. "It's cold," he whispered. "Cold as stone." The others scribbled in frenzy. I only saw his eyes. They had gone glassy, unblinking, as though staring at something no one else could see. And then he was gone. Not a scream, not a struggle. His body collapsed to the floor, but his eyes were still fixed on the altar. Empty, wide, staring, as if whatever he saw had stolen not his flesh, but his presence. The wood dimmed once more as though satisfied. The instruments recorded nothing. The air was clean, untouched. The body lay still at our feet. Father Rodrigo's voice trembled as he whispered, "The fire feeds. Not on wood, but on us." I did not sleep that night. None of us did. For the first time, the village began to whisper not of miracles, but of hunger. And deep inside I knew the truth. The altar would glow again. It was only waiting. Episode 3. The confession that fed the light. It began with a whisper, a trembling voice breaking the heavy silence of the church. A woman stepped forward. Maria, the widow who had lived at the edge of the village, known for never attending Mass unless forced. Her eyes were hollow, her hands shaking, as though something unseen had dragged her to the altar. "I must speak," she said, her voice cracking. "If I don't, it will consume me." No one moved. The villagers pressed close, their fear tangled with curiosity. Father Rodrigo tried to silence her, but she sank to her knees, clutching the pew as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. "I killed my child." The words fell heavy, poisonous, echoing through the nave. Gasps ripped through the air. Some crossed themselves, others drew back in horror. But the altar responded. The glow flared instantly, like a heart ignited by sin. Crimson light washed over Maria's face, making her look both damned and saintly. Her confession had become fuel. She sobbed, her voice rising. He was not meant to live. His birth was cursed. I buried him beneath the fig tree before he breathed his first cry. The altar pulsed brighter with every word, the light trembling in rhythm with her sobs. The wooden beams of the church creaked. The walls seemed to lean inward, and in that blinding glow, shadows crawled across the floor, shadows with shapes that didn't belong to anyone standing there. Father Rodrigo clutched his rosary, shouting prayers, but his words cracked against the air like broken glass. The glow only deepened. "And Maria," she smiled through her tears. "Do you see?" she cried. "It forgives me." But forgiveness was not what we saw. Her body jerked violently, her head snapping back, and the light wrapped around her like a crown of thorns. For a single heartbeat, her face glowed with a radiance not of this world. Then her body crumpled, lifeless, before the altar. The glow dimmed, satisfied once more. Silence fell heavy as stone. We were left with this taste of iron on our tongues, the echo of her sin carved into our bones. And we understood. The altar did not merely burn without fire. It hungered for secrets too heavy for the world, sins too dark for heaven. And from that night on, confessions were no longer whispered in the booth. They were dragged, bleeding, before the altar. Episode 4. The Child Who Saw Shadows. After Maria's death, the church was never empty. Some came to gawk, others to pray, but all of us came with fear stitched into our bones. The altar, quiet by day, seemed to breathe by night, its glow faint, as if waiting for the next confession. It was during one of those nights that little Elena spoke. She was only 8, with eyes too old for her small face, the orphan taken in by the nuns. She tugged at my sleeve as the congregation knelt in silence. "Do you see them?" she whispered. I frowned, thinking she meant the candles or the restless pilgrims, but her finger pointed toward the altar, where the faint crimson shimmer had begun to stir. "They come out when it glows," she said. "The men in black robes. They stand behind everyone, whispering the prayers backward." I froze. My skin crawled. But I told her not to speak such things. Children imagine shadows, I reminded myself. Yet her eyes did not blink, and her tiny hand trembled in mine. That night, the altar flared brighter than it had in weeks. The church doors slammed shut of their own accord, sealing us in. And then, I saw it, just for an instant. The pews stretched longer than they should. The corners of the church deepened into impossible darkness. Between us and the walls, shapes began to rise. Tall, cloaked figures, their faces hidden, their hands folded in mockery of prayer. They moved in silence, their shadows spilling across the floor, stretching to our feet. Elena clutched me tighter. "They're counting us," she whimpered. "But they never count me. They just watch me." Father Rodrigo lifted the cross high, shouting for the demons to depart. His voice echoed, but the shadows did not move. They only tilted their heads, as though mocking him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the glow dimmed. The church returned to itself. The pilgrims gasped with relief, some laughing nervously, others weeping. But Elena would not unclench her fist. "They don't leave when the light fades," she whispered into my ear. "They just hide. They're waiting for the altar to shine again." I looked at her then, and saw that her pupils reflected a faint red glow, as though the altar had marked her. From that night I began to wonder. Perhaps the altar did not just feed on our sins. Perhaps it was recruiting witnesses. Episode 5. the bloodless offering. By then, fear had already taken root in every home. Some prayed harder, others locked their doors at night. But all of us knew the altar would not remain silent for long. And when desperation takes hold, men do terrible things in the name of salvation. It was Don Mateo who broke first, the wealthy farmer whose fields had withered, whose wife had wasted away in sickness. He arrived at the church dragging a goat by a rope, its hooves scraping the stone steps, its eyes rolling white with terror. "This is what it wants," he muttered, voice wild, eyes bloodshot. "A sacrifice, and it will heal us." The villagers begged him to stop, but hunger for hope is stronger than reason. He shoved past us all, pulled the struggling animal up to the altar, and forced it down upon the glowing wood. The moment its body touched the surface, the church shuddered. The goat let out one strangled cry, then silence. No blood spilled, no body remained. It had vanished. Only the altar burned brighter, glowing with a deep, steady pulse as though satisfied. We screamed. Some fled. Others knelt in horror, believing they had witnessed a holy act. But I could not look away, for in that glow, I saw something shift within the wood, an imprint, as if the altar had swallowed the creature whole and recorded its outline in light. Father Rodrigo fell to his knees, clutching the rail, his face pale as ash. "Do you not see?" he cried. "It takes what is offered, and it gives nothing back." But Don Mateo laughed, a desperate, broken sound. "You're wrong," he shouted. "My wife will be healed. My land will flourish. It promised me." His words cut off. His mouth hung open, his chest heaving as though the air itself had turned to stone. Then, before our eyes, his skin withered, tightening over bone. His flesh seemed to drain away, as if the altar was drinking him dry without touching him. He collapsed beside the glowing wood, nothing but a husk, his eyes staring in horror at the light that had betrayed him. The congregation erupted into chaos. Mothers pulled children close, men shouted prayers, but the altar's glow remained steady, calm, almost smug. It had consumed flesh, it had consumed faith, and now we all knew the truth. The altar had learned to hunger for more than words. Episode 6, The Fire That Spoke Without Voice. After Don Mateo's ruin, no one dared approach the altar, yet the glow would not sleep. It flickered in the night like a heartbeat that belonged to something ancient and patient, waiting. We tried to ignore it. But ignoring hunger does not end it. It began with whispers, though no lips moved. People swore they heard words inside their skulls, a voice without sound, threading through their thoughts as though it had always been there. I felt it first during prayer. Kneeling before the pew, I heard my own voice repeating the Pater Noster. But then, a second prayer joined mine. Not aloud, not in the air, inside me. Each syllable ran backward, as if undoing every holy word. Others gasped, clutching their heads. Father Rodrigo staggered, his rosary slipping from his fingers. The entire church froze, each person silently reciting their devotions, while another language, cold and broken, echoed within. The glow swelled, feeding on our fear. The altar pulsed, red deepening into black. And in that hum of light, meaning poured into us like poison. "Confess, feed me, or burn within yourselves." A woman shrieked and tore at her veil, crying out sins she had never admitted, adulteries, thefts, curses against her own children. As her words spilled, the altar dimmed slightly, as though sated. But her body collapsed afterward, limp, her confession stolen as surely as her breath. We realized then, it did not need our offerings placed upon the wood. It needed our voices, our souls trembling beneath guilt. Our darkest truths were its feast. And worse still, some among us began to seek its whisper. They longed to hear the forbidden words. They leaned into the silent voice as though it offered not damnation but intimacy, a secret communion. I remember the way Father Rodrigo's face twisted, torn between faith and fear. "This is no fire of heaven," he whispered hoarsely. "This is the mouth of hell, and it has found a tongue within us." The light pulsed again, brighter, heavier, filling the church with a suffocating glow. And in that moment, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. The altar did not speak to us, it spoke through us. Episode 7, The Priest's Doubt. Father Rodrigo had always been the anchor of our village, his voice steady, his sermons fierce, his faith carved into him like the stone walls of the church itself. But after the altar began to whisper, something in him cracked. At night, I heard him pacing through the nave, his rosary clutched so tight the beads cut into his palms. He prayed aloud, but between the prayers came pauses, long silences where his lips moved without sound, as though he were listening instead of speaking. I saw the hollows beneath his eyes deepen. He had stopped sleeping. He confessed, not to us, but to himself, that dreams plagued him. Dreams where he stood at the altar, engulfed in its glow, his body burning without fire, his voice no longer his own. And always, he said, the dream ended with the same question whispered into his soul: "Are you praying to me, or am I praying through you?" The doubt began to bleed into his sermons. His words stumbled. His hands shook when he lifted the host. Once during Mass he froze mid-prayer, his gaze locked on the altar. The silence was unbearable. Then, in a trembling voice, he admitted what none of us dared to say aloud. What if this is not a test from God? What if it is God forgotten? What if what we kneel before is not heaven's fire, but its absence? Gasps spread through the pews. A priest was not meant to question, not meant to falter, yet his doubt infected us faster than faith ever had. That night I found him alone, kneeling before the pulsing glow. Tears streaked his face. "I gave my life to him," he whispered. "But this answers more quickly than he ever did." And then, I swear I saw it. The altar flared brighter, as though savoring his despair. Shadows gathered around him, curling at his feet like smoke that left no scent. I called his name, desperate to pull him away, but he did not move. His eyes reflected the crimson glow, hollow and haunted. "Do you see?" he murmured. "Perhaps this is the true confessional. Perhaps this is where God hid himself when the world grew deaf to his voice." But I knew then it was not God listening. It was something older, hungrier, and it had found its strongest servant in the man who once defended us. Father Rodrigo was no longer our anchor. He had become the altar's. Episode 8, The Forbidden Scripture. The church had stood for centuries, yet none of us truly knew its foundations. After Father Rodrigo's sermons turned from faith to trembling doubt, a group of villagers began searching the crypt beneath the nave, hoping to find relics that might explain the curse or banish it. That is when they discovered the book. It was hidden behind a crumbling wall, wrapped in rotting cloth, bound in leather so dry it cracked at the touch. Its pages were brittle, stained dark as though soaked in blood long ago. But the words, oh, the words were untouched, written in a hand that seemed to move across the parchment even when no one touched it. We gathered in the candlelight as Father Rodrigo opened it, his fingers shaking. A single phrase was written across the first page, in Latin older than the walls themselves: Ignis sine cinere, lumen sine Deo. Fire without ash, light without God. The air thickened as he read further. The scripture told of an altar built not to honor heaven, but to bind something buried beneath it, not a demon, not a saint, but an ancient hunger, older than the church, older even than the faith we claimed. The passages spoke of confessions not as redemption, but as offerings. Each sin whispered aloud was described as a spark, each secret shame a fuel. The more the people confessed, the brighter the altar would burn, until the boundary between this world and the next would collapse. And then came the most terrifying line of all. When the priest doubts, the altar awakens. We froze. All eyes turned to Father Rodrigo, whose face had gone pale as bone. His doubt had not been weakness. It had been the very key to the glow that haunted us. He slammed the book shut, his voice raw. "No one must read this again. Burn it. Destroy it." But before the villagers could move, the altar pulsed violently, casting the room into blood-red light. The book trembled in his hands, its pages fluttering on their own, as though the words themselves were alive. And in the glow, I swear I heard laughter, not with sound, but with thought. The altar did not fear the scripture, it fed on it. From that moment we understood. This was no miracle, no curse of chance. This was design. The altar was a door, and the book was the key we were never meant to find. Episode 9, The Night the Bells Rang Alone. It was the night no one forgot. The night the bells rang, though no hands touched them. The village slept beneath a swollen moon when the first toll shattered the silence. One heavy strike, then another, then a peal of sound that rolled across the valley like thunder. People poured from their homes, eyes wide with fear. Everyone knew the church tower had been locked since the day the altar began to glow. Yet the bells tolled on, louder, faster, as if 100 unseen hands were yanking the ropes in frenzy. We gathered before the church, the door trembling against its hinges. Some begged Father Rodrigo to stop it, but he only shook his head, clutching his rosary until blood ran from his palms. "This is not my doing," he whispered. "It is his." The doors burst open. The glow poured out like a flood, spilling crimson light across the cobblestones, and with it came a hum, low at first, then swelling until it pressed into our skulls, filling us with the taste of iron and smoke, though the air was clean. Inside, the altar blazed brighter than ever before, but it was not alone. Flames with no source leapt along the rafters, curling across the walls without leaving a mark. They flickered in rhythm with the bells, every strike summoning a new wave of impossible fire. I stepped closer and froze, for in each tongue of flame I saw faces, not saints, not angels, but the villagers who had confessed before the altar. Maria's hollow eyes, Don Mateo's withered face. They mouthed prayers we could not understand, their lips moving in silence, their expressions twisted in agony. Elena clung to my arm, trembling. "They're not burning," she whispered. "They're trapped." The bells roared again, shaking the tower until dust rained from the beams. And then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Every flame vanished. The glow sank back into the altar. Steady, patient. The pews stood untouched, the rafters whole. Only the air remained heavy, thick with despair. But above us, in the tower, a final sound echoed. 3 slow strikes, deliberate like the tolling of a funeral bell. No one dared to move, for we understood. The bells had not rung to summon us. They had rung to announce something. Something that had just awakened beneath the altar. Episode 10. The Offering of Silence. After the bells, the village fell into panic. Prayers no longer comforted us. They only seemed to feed the glow. And so the people made a desperate pact to resist. One evening, under Father Rodrigo's trembling gaze, we gathered in the church once more. But this time, no hymns rose, no prayers were whispered. We sat in heavy silence, our breath shallow, our eyes fixed anywhere but the altar. The glow began faintly, a dull red like embers hidden in ash. It pulsed once, twice, waiting, but no one moved. No one confessed. No one gave it what it wanted. Minutes stretched like hours. The silence pressed against our skulls until it felt unbearable. Then, something changed. The altar began to tremble, not the wood, not the stone, but the light itself. It quivered like a living thing starved, and the air filled with a sound none of us had ever heard. A low, guttural moan, not human, not holy, a sound of hunger. Elena covered her ears, tears streaking down her face. "It doesn't want our words," she whispered. "It wants our silence." And suddenly the moan grew louder, reverberating through the rafters. The pews shook. The crucifix above the altar creaked as though straining under unseen weight. Shadows bled across the floor, stretching from the altar to our feet like hands reaching. Someone gasped, just one breath too loud. The glow flared instantly, slashing through the silence like lightning. The man who had gasped clutched his chest, his mouth open in a silent scream. No sound came out, only blood trickling down his chin. He collapsed, lifeless, as though the altar had stolen the very breath from his lungs. We froze, terrified to even exhale, but the moaning continued, louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices rising from nowhere. They sounded like those who had already been taken. Maria, Don Mateo, the vanished scholar. Each voice layered into the dreadful hum, begging us to break our silence. But we held it, we dared not feed it. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the glow dimmed, the voices ebbed, the church settled into stillness again. We stumbled out into the night, broken and trembling, but as I turned for one last glance, I saw the altar flicker faintly, as though smiling in the dark. It had not been defeated, only starved, and hunger, I realized, always returns stronger. Episode 11, The Shadow Mass. We thought silence could starve it. We were wrong. The altar had simply grown patient, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the moment when shadows were thick enough to hold a congregation of their own. It began on a Sunday, when the church filled with villagers too afraid to stay away, yet too guilty to resist its pull. We sat in uneasy rows, our lips pressed shut, our eyes avoiding the crimson shimmer that bled from the altar. And then it began. The glow pulsed outward, soft at first, like a ripple across still water. The pews trembled, the air grew heavy, thick with the smell of incense that no one had lit. And then, before our eyes, it appeared. A second mass, but it was not ours. From the altar's glow, shadows peeled away from the walls, tall, cloaked figures with faces hidden beneath hoods. They stood where we stood, knelt where we knelt, their movements eerily synchronized with ours, like grotesque reflections. Every gesture we made, they mirrored, but reversed. When we bowed our heads, they raised theirs. When we pressed our hands together, they tore theirs apart. And when Father Rodrigo clutched the chalice, lifting it with shaking hands, one of the shadows raised a vessel of its own, a dark goblet that dripped with something too thick to be wine. The voices came next, not spoken aloud but vibrating through our skulls. The shadows chanted in a language no one could name, syllables that scraped like iron across stone. Their mass unfolded alongside ours, but inverted, twisted, each prayer a curse, each blessing a wound. Elena buried her face in my sleeve, trembling. "They're mocking us," she whispered, "but they're stronger than we are." I looked up and saw what she meant. The shadow congregation was growing. For every villager who trembled, another figure joined the dark mass. Soon there were more of them than of us, and when the final bell tolled, their priest stepped forward, a towering shape cloaked in black, faceless, holding its chalice high. The altar blazed behind him, pulsing like a living heart. For the first time, the shadow congregation did not mirror us. They led, they bowed, they drank. They offered themselves not to God, but to the hunger beneath the wood. And I realized then, we were no longer the faithful in this church. We were the intruders. The true mass belonged to them. Episode 12, The Fire That Took Flesh. By now, the church no longer felt like ours. Each time the altar glowed, it bent the air, filled the nave with shadows that weren't our own. But that night, the glow went further. It stepped out from the wood and into us. It began with Luis, the miller's son. He was kneeling closest to the altar, head bowed, when the crimson pulse flared violently. His body jolted, his mouth opening as though to scream, yet no sound came out. Instead, the light poured into him. We watched in horror as his skin shimmered, veins glowing faintly beneath his flesh. His eyes rolled back, then snapped forward, burning with the same color as the altar. He staggered to his feet, his chest rising and falling as though a second breath had taken root inside him. "Do you hear it?" he rasped, his voice layered with something not his own. "It lives in me now." The congregation recoiled, some fleeing for the doors, others frozen in place. But Father Rodrigo stepped forward, clutching his crucifix high. "Leave him, foul spirit," he cried, his voice breaking. "You have no place here." Luis laughed, a laugh that did not belong to him. It was deeper, hollow, echoing through the rafters as though the church itself had joined in. He lifted his arms wide, and as he did, the glow spread across his body, igniting without flame. His flesh did not burn. Instead, the fire shaped him, sculpting him into something more than human. And then, the impossible. The altar dimmed. Its wood grew dark, almost lifeless, as if it had emptied itself into him. Luis turned to us, his eyes blazing. "You feared the altar," he said, his voice splitting into two tones. "But the altar was only the doorway. Now the fire walks." He moved through the pews, and wherever his glowing hand touched, shadows sprang up, wrapping around villagers, pulling screams from their throats. One by one they collapsed, not burned, but hollow, their bodies limp, their eyes wide with terror. Elena clung to me, sobbing. "It's choosing a body. It doesn't need the wood anymore." I could not answer her, for deep inside I knew she was right. The altar had learned to wear flesh, and now nothing could contain it. As the last of the candles blew out, Luis's burning eyes fixed on Father Rodrigo, and with a smile that was not his, he whispered, "You doubted. That is why I found you." Episode 13, The Last Confession. The church smelled of iron and smoke, though no fire burned. Luis's body still glowed faintly, his eyes twin embers fixed on Father Rodrigo. The villagers cowered in the pews, too broken to pray, too terrified to breathe. And then the voice came, Not from Luis's mouth, not from the altar, but from everywhere. Confess. The word rattled the rafters, thick and heavy as chains. Father Rodrigo clutched the crucifix to his chest, his knuckles white. For a moment I thought he would resist, that he would cast holy fire upon the thing that mocked us. But instead, he sank to his knees. His lips trembled, his eyes brimmed with tears. "I cannot fight you," he whispered, "so I will give you what you demand." The villagers gasped. Elena sobbed into her hands. But Rodrigo's voice grew steadier as he spoke, as though releasing a weight he had carried his whole life. "I confess, I have doubted him. Every day I wore his robes. I wondered if he truly listened. I prayed, and heard nothing. I begged, and was met with silence. And when this altar glowed, I believed for a moment it was him at last, answering." The glow around Luis flared, brighter, feeding on each word. The shadows pressed closer, leaning over the pews like vultures. "I confess," Rodrigo continued, his voice breaking, "that when I held the bodies of our dead, I envied them. That when I baptized children, I feared I was only marking them for death. And worst of all, I confess that I loved this altar's voice more than I loved God's silence." The final words left him trembling. His crucifix slipped from his hands, clattering against the stones. The altar exploded in light. Crimson beams ripped through the church, painting every wall, every soul, in blood-red brilliance. Luis staggered back, laughing, his body convulsing as though the fire within him had grown too vast for flesh. And then silence. Rodrigo raised his head, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. But in that emptiness, something else lingered. A smile. Not of peace, not of salvation, but of surrender. The voice filled the church once more, colder now, triumphant. "The priest has confessed. The door is open." The altar blazed like a living sun, and for the first time, I realized it no longer needed our sins to feed. It had consumed the faith meant to destroy it. And faith, once devoured, cannot be given back. Episode 14, The Burning Without Flame. The night after Father Rodrigo's final confession, the village ceased to feel like a village at all. It felt like the nave of one vast church, its walls invisible, its ceiling made of sky. For the altar's glow no longer stayed inside the chapel. It spilled outward, flooding every street, every doorway, every home. At first it was faint, a reddish shimmer clinging to the cobblestones like mist. But then it thickened, pulsing, stretching across fields and rooftops until the entire valley throbbed with the same heartbeat we had once seen only in the wood. The boundaries dissolved. When I stepped outside my house, I no longer saw a street. I saw pews. The stones beneath my feet had become polished like marble. The fig tree by the well twisted upward, its branches forming a grotesque candelabra, dripping with sap that gleamed like wax. The village had been rewritten, transformed into a cathedral not built by hands, but by hunger. People staggered from their homes, their faces pale in the glow. Some dropped to their knees instinctively, as if pulled by invisible strings. Others clawed at their eyes, unable to stand the sight. And above us, the church bell tolled on its own. Slow and deliberate, counting out our breaths, Luis emerged from the shadows, still burning faintly with the altar's fire. His voice carried across the square, doubled, layered, a chorus within one throat. "You tried to silence it," he said, "but now silence belongs to it. You tried to cage it, but now the village itself is the altar." As if to prove him right, the ground beneath us rippled, the very earth glowing faintly. Every home flickered with the same blood-red pulse. The walls between sacred and profane, inside and outside, had collapsed. We were all kneeling now, whether we bent willingly or not. Elena clutched my arm, her face ashen. "It's making the world into a church," she whispered, "and we are the candles." Her words proved true. One by one, villagers began to glow faintly, their bodies trembling with light that was not their own. Some screamed as it overtook them, others smiled as though they had found salvation. But whether in terror or joy, each became part of the burning, flames without fire, fuel for a mass no human tongue could name. And in that dreadful moment I understood. The altar was no longer confined to stone and wood. It had become everywhere, everything. There was no leaving the church anymore, because now the church was the world. Episode 15, The Altar That Burned Without Fire. By the time the sun should have risen, there was no sunrise, only red. The valley throbbed with the same unholy glow. every stone and every tree bending beneath it. Our village no longer existed. It had become a single sanctuary, pulsing like a living heart. I wandered through streets that had turned into aisles, where neighbors knelt in endless rows, their mouths moving in silent prayer none of us had chosen. The altar's rhythm pulsed through our bones, commanding, consuming. Luis stood at the center of the square, if it could still be called a square, his body ablaze with the fire that did not burn. He raised his arms. His voice multiplied into a chorus of tones. "It is finished," he declared. The world itself kneels. The earth groaned beneath us. I saw houses fold into arches, wells stretch into pillars, even the sky tremble with streaks of crimson. The village was gone. We were all inside a church that had no end. Father Rodrigo knelt among us, his face hollow, his eyes empty. His lips moved in a confession that had no words, a prayer that belonged to something older than God. And I knew then he was no longer resisting. He had become the first celebrant of a mass that would never cease. Around me, people began to glow, their bodies trembling as light seeped from their mouths and eyes. They did not scream. They did not resist. They became candles, living flames without heat, flickering silently in the vast cathedral the altar had created. Elena's small hand clutched mine. Her voice trembled. "Is this heaven or hell?" I could not answer, for the altar's glow had spread so wide, so deep, that I could no longer tell if we were being judged, punished, or embraced. The altar pulsed one last time, brighter than 1,000 suns, redder than 1,000 wounds, and in that final blinding moment, I saw faces within the glow. Maria, Don Mateo, the scholar, all the dead, all the lost. They did not weep, they did not scream, they only stared, as though they had been waiting for us to join them. When the light dimmed, there was no village, no sky, no earth, only the altar, burning without fire, stretching into eternity. And as the silence settled over us, a single truth echoed in my mind, one I could never speak aloud. It was not salvation. It was not damnation. It was something far worse. It was forever.
Epilogue, The Witness. They say the village never existed. Maps show nothing but a barren valley, a stretch of earth no one remembers living on. The church, the bells, the people gone, as though they had been swallowed whole. And yet, I am still here. I walk through places that should be roads, but they feel like aisles. The wind moves like a choir, whispering words backward. At night, when I close my eyes, I see the altar glowing inside my skull, inside my chest, beating in time with my own heart. Sometimes I hear footsteps behind me. Shadows that do not belong to me stretch across the ground. And when I turn, I see cloaked figures, waiting, patient, their faces hidden. I cannot leave. No matter how far I walk, I end up here again, standing before a place that no longer stands, kneeling before an altar that no longer exists. But I know the truth. The altar did not vanish. It did not die. It spread. Every church that smells faintly of smoke though no candles are lit. Every chapel where shadows bend the wrong way. Every whispered confession that feels heavier than it should. The altar is waiting. It has no fire, no ash, no wood. It only needs you. And when you kneel, when you finally dare to confess, it will burn again, forever.